It's almost time for NERX, the Northeastern region of the NMRA's virtual convention. Tune in Monday, March 17th through Thursday, March 20th, as the NER delivers a fantastic lineup of how-to clinics, roundtable discussions, and layout tours right to your screen. Be sure to check out the amazing work in the model showcase and tips and tricks, short video segments showing modeling tips that don't fit into a full clinic. NERX, it's like being at a convention without leaving your home. For a full schedule, check out their website at nerx.org. If you're looking to bring more realism to your layout industries, look no further than tullymodels.com, the home of Southern Tier Grain Modeler Supply and Steel Mill Modeler Supply. With models to fit steam, transition, and diesel eras, Kevin Tully has you covered with all of the components you'll need to take your grain and steel mills to the next level. Check out the entire catalog at tullymodels.com. Discover prototypical track and turnouts with the Roadmaster series from Oak Hill Model Railroad Track Supply. Proudly made in the United States, Oak Hill's handcrafted turnouts provide unparalleled detail and accuracy, giving your layout museum-quality track work at an affordable price. Whether fully built or in easy-to-assemble kit form, Roadmaster provides all the details of real track. Looking for a custom piece of track work? Oak Hill can help with custom turnouts, diamonds, crossings, and more. Check out all of their offerings on their website, ohrtracksupply.com. ATLP Extra is our monthly newsletter delivered right to your inbox each month. Sign up for free at atlpextra.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. This show's topic is going to be small layouts, big potential, making the most of what space you have. And joining me to talk about that, Thomas Klimoski. Tom, welcome to the show.
Good evening, Ray. Great to be back on your show.
Yeah, great to have you back. It's been a long while. I'm going to have to go back and look. We'll put a link in the show notes back to the interview, but you were kind of early on when we started the podcast. So it's been a little bit since we've seen you, but glad to have you back here with a great topic that I know is near and dear to your heart.
Yes. Great to be back on the show with you.
So we were thinking about this idea, and I reached out to you because you are the author of the book, Building the Right Size Layout, Designing and Operating a Small Switching Layout. And we talk a lot here on the podcast. We talk to folks with some really big layouts, the John Parkers of the world. And then we talk to some folks like the Tom Johnsons with the much smaller layouts and folks in between. And of course, it's near and dear to my heart as well, because I have a small switching layout. So today, have some fun talking about small switching layouts and the potential they have to be very entertaining, very fun, and very achievable. So looking forward to that conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. There's a lot to it. It's when I wrote the book, I came up with the title Right Size because there's no one size fits all when it comes to layouts. Some people, a large layout is perfect. They've got the right people. They've got all the other things that they need to make that successful. And for other people, if they try to build a large layout, it's the wrong size layout and they get frustrated and then they drop it, leave the hobby, take up something else. I hate to see that. So that was one of the reasons behind writing the book. Plus, I had a lot of people asking me questions about, how did you do this? How did you do that? Why did you do this? So I said, somebody should write this down. And I looked in the mirror and it was me.
Yeah. Yeah, that moment when you realize you have a book inside of you, and so glad you did. You did an excellent job with it. It's a great read, and we'll share a bunch of links are going to be shared in our notes aroundthelayout.com/147, including that book and much more that we'll talk about here in a bit. But for those that don't know Tom Klimoski, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, like most people, I started off as a child with a Lionel layout and just kind of got really hooked on model railroading. Through my teenage years, I had a Lionel layout out on the back porch of my house in Miami, which is not the best place to have a layout, but when you want to have a layout, you make room for it. Somehow, some way, I had very understanding parents. And then, life goes on, you kind of move on. And a little bit later, after I got married, started having kids and stuff, I said, well, maybe I can build a layout here somewhere and have something to do with my oldest son. So started off with a 4x8 layout, like most people. And it just went from there. Joined a model train club in Miami called Echoes, which is East Coast HO Exhibitors Society. And we had modules that we'd set up at a show, and really just started meeting people and really started getting into the hobby. And then ended up moving up here to North Georgia, up in the mountains. I had a layout in Miami. It kind of grew. It started as a certain size and kept getting bigger and bigger. And I learned a lot from it. I learned a lot of what not to do, which is almost as important as what to do, and what I liked about the hobby, which was switching in my case. So when I moved up here to the mountains, I realized that my pool of operators was not going to be very deep. It was going to be a very, very shallow pool. So why build a large layout if I can't get the number of people that I need to run it, which is one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later. So I have a 9'2" by 10'6" room in the basement. It's basically a glorified closet, or maybe a small bedroom. There's no windows in it, so technically it would be a closet. But when the house was sort of designed, I made it a little bit bigger than the original design. And that's where my layout is. And I'm modeling the Georgia Northeastern, which is a prototype railroad here in North Georgia. 93 track miles from the south end to the north end. Good majority of it on the north end is not run on, so it's primarily about 50 miles. And that's my prototype. I belong to a model train club that models the exact same line, but in the 1950s, which is kind of interesting. So I have my 1950s, the old line, which is the Ellen and Old line, which is what the railroad started off as. And now it's the Georgia Northeastern, still on the old line tracks. And it's a neat little short line. It was family owned and operated for many years. And then recently it was sold to Patriot Rail. It's probably been almost 10 years now. It's been in the hands of Patriot Rail, and they have taken it over. And I also worked as a trainman on the Blue Ridge Scenic Railway, which was a subsidiary of the Georgia Northeastern. And I learned a lot from that, being, we'll call it kind of a conductor, if you will. We would do the brake tests, and I'd ride in the engine with the engineer as a second set of eyes. And if something happened to him, I knew how to stop the train. I wasn't engineer qualified, of course, but I got to learn a lot, talk to the prototype engineers about what they did, how they did it, and just really took off with, prototype information. Made friends with some of the engineers. Some other friends of mine are retired or current engineers. And that's kind of how I got into operations. And that's where a lot of the information that came out of the book came from friends. And basically that was about it. So now I've been operating my layout. The layout's been, I believe it's, let's say this will be its 12th anniversary coming up here in June. So 12 years, relatively complete. And I just hold operating sessions now.
Awesome stuff. You mentioned Blue Ridge Scenic Railway. Always makes me think, because I've been on the Blue Ridge Scenic Railway, taken that ride, and my wife has put one foot in Tennessee, one foot in Georgia, which is one of the tricks. What's the name of the town? It's two towns in kind of in one, right?
It's McKaysville, Georgia, Copper Hill, Tennessee, and the state line runs right through the middle of the town. A couple of interesting stories. The line actually goes through part of the grocery store, and they were debating as to whether they would pay Tennessee taxes or Georgia taxes. So it came down to, where is the cash register? The cash register is in Georgia, so they pay Georgia taxes. And then there's the line goes through the middle of a building, and they serve alcohol. Well, on one side, you can have alcohol. On the other side, you can't have alcohol. So you couldn't bring your beer across the state line if you went to the bathroom or went to some tables on the other side. So you had to leave your beer on one side over the state line. It's just very interesting, kind of a neat thing. But the train, the engine and the first three cars make it into Tennessee. The rest of the 7 cars and the engine on the other end don't ever leave Georgia.
It's pretty funny. Yeah. And it's a neat trip, beautiful ride, great equipment. It was a great time when we got to take that ride, and neat that little connection back to you with the Blue Ridge Scenic Railway. And yeah, we'll even share a link to the Blue Ridge Scenic Railway. Check it out if you ever find yourself up in that, what was it, northwestern Georgia area, right? That's
correct. Yeah, in the Blue Ridge area, or it's about an hour and a half, 2 hours north of Atlanta, up a main highway. So it's a really neat place to go and spend the day in Blue Ridge, see the town, ride the train, and see some of the other sites around it. It's a neat little town.
Absolutely. Well, getting back to small layout, big potential, let's talk a little bit about a little introduction to building a small layout. And some of these terms that we kind of talk about. You mentioned earlier that right sized really isn't, it's more about what's right for you, not a right size in this hobby. There is no one answer to this question.
That's correct. Yes. Again, like I mentioned, you could build the wrong layout. If you want long trains and mainline operation and stuff, and you build a switching layout, probably not going to be very happy with it. So you need to do some self-examination, if you will, and see, what do you like? What do you like about the prototype? What do you want to model? If those don't come together, then you're probably not going to have a successful layout.
It's kind of what we talk about, and what's been fun about the podcast is learning people's why, and it's about finding your own why. What is it that you want? Why are you building a layout? Not necessarily what, and certain not definitely not what other people want. It's what you really love about the hobby.
Exactly, exactly. And one of the other ones, the words that I like to use is an achievable layout. It's something that you can achieve, something that you can see you actually building and being successful at it. I've had a couple of guests come over to the layout room, and they look around, they go, "Wow, you got a lot in here in a small space. It's very achievable." And they say, "I hope you don't take that as an insult." I said, "No, that's great. I mean, I'm glad that you see that you could achieve what I've been able to do." It's not some of these layouts you look at, you walk in, it's like, wow, it's spectacular, but I could never do that. I just don't have the time, the energy, or some of the other things that we're going to talk about. So you want to build something that's achievable for you. Now, the larger layout may be achievable for the John Parkers out there. He
Right.
has the crew, he has all the other things that he needed to make it achievable for him. But if I tried to build that layout, I wouldn't have been successful. It's just not what I have in mind with the hobby.
Let's talk about some of those factors to consider when building a layout. When you're starting to think about all of this, kind of like the checklist of examination here. What are some of those things that you would want to factor in?
Well, probably for most model railroaders, the biggest question is space. Do I have the space to build this layout? If not, do I need a shed? Maybe like Don Iris has.
Right.
Do something to make some space for it. I looked here, and I got permission from the CEO to build a layout, and she said, "You can make it as big as you want, but in the basement, we still got to have a recreation room, a bathroom, a craft room, storage room, and this." And the layout size room kept getting smaller and smaller. And she said, "You sure that's big enough?" I said, "Yes, for what I want to do, 9 by 10 will be adequate." Yes, it would have been nice to be a little bit bigger, but I wouldn't have put the bigger space into the layout. I would have made the aisles a little bit bigger, made it a little more comfortable in the room to walk around. My aisles, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later, is aisle space. My aisles are 28 inches. It would have been nice if they were 36. Something to consider. You want to squeeze every inch out of it, but then you impact on the ergonomics, the how the people interact with it. And if it becomes uncomfortable to operate, you're not going to be happy with it.
Agreed. Agreed.
And then some of the next items are, do you have the time? Everybody's got things going on. I'm retired. I'm a retired firefighter. I've got all the time in the world. Not really.
You'd like to
It's a
think you have all the time in the world. Yeah.
it's amazing how busy I am with stuff that it's the difference is I'm doing what I want to do, not what I have to do. I don't have to go to work, but I have a lot of other things I want to do. And there's other projects that need to take, priority over my modeling time, my hobby time. So for each person, that's different. Some people may have a lot more time they want to dedicate to a layout, and that's fantastic. I have other things that I'm involved with as a volunteer firefighter here in the county that I'm in. I'm busy with that. I'm busy with a lot of other things. I was a volunteer on the Blue Ridge Scenic, working as a trainman. Although I was paid, it was paid volunteer. So I was busy with that. And then just other things that get in the way of, spending time. And then the next one is really big is, do you have the money? How much money do you have to dedicate to this hobby before it becomes, a problem with the CEO or chief financial officer or whoever that might be? That might be just you.
Right.
Do you have the money? Everybody talks about how expensive the hobby's getting. Keep it as a smaller layout. Your expenses are going to be less. You don't have as many turnouts. If you're buying 10 turnouts versus buying 100 turnouts, what's that going to do to your budget? Just things to consider. And how about maintenance? Nobody likes to talk about maintenance, but do you have the time, and do you want to spend a good amount of your time cleaning track? And less track, less cleaning, a little bit quicker. Another one is availability of operators. Like I mentioned, when I moved up here, I knew that it was going to be hard to find operators. In our club, which is in a small town here about an hour away from me, it's in Mineral Bluff, Georgia, we have about 40 members, and we do an operating session twice a month. We struggle to get 8 to 10 people to show up for an operating session. And it's a fantastic layout to operate. We will operate with timetable and train orders. We're running with a dispatcher. We've got all kinds of great things, great jobs for people to do. A lot of our club members not really interested in operations. So we open it up to visitors. If you're in the area and you want to come by and operate, give us a call. We'd love to have you. We'll set you up with a throttle and somebody else to run as a pilot with you. And we welcome visitors to come to the operating sessions. It's not a closed door session, if you will. You just need to let us know that you're coming.
I think that one really also ties into the why and who are you building your layout for, and especially take a look around, because if you're out in the middle of nowhere and you start building this massive layout that requires so many people and they're not there, you really didn't build it for you. You built it for these people that don't exist. So, and it's amazing. We had, again, we'll pick on John Parker again. We had him on the last Talking Ops with Don Iris, and it's amazing, but he's got the crew. He has the support system there in that Denver, Colorado-ish area where there's a lot of folks, but Northeastern Georgia, or I'm thinking of our friends out in Wyoming and Montana, and who are you building this for? And it isn't necessarily build it and they will come. They may not be there to come. So you got to really be careful with that.
Absolutely. Some of the other questions to ask yourself is, what are your operational goals? Do you enjoy switching versus mainline running? And a real easy way to determine that is, how do you like to watch the prototype? Are you happy to sit trackside and watch the mainline freights blast by at 60 miles an hour and you like to watch the long trains go by? Or would you prefer to sit in a yard or an industrial area and watch a little switcher banging cars back and forth between industries and the yard or something like that? In my case, it's the switching operations that I enjoy. If I'm going to watch a prototype, that's what I would lead towards, is watching that switch crew do their job, and the if even better is if I have a radio and I can listen to their cadence of calling down cars and doing all that stuff. That to me is part of the operations, and that's what I enjoy having replicated on my layout, is having a conductor and an engineer. I work with a 2-person crew. Part of that is the conductor is telling the engineer, pull ahead 3 cars. Okay, that'll do. And then, switch line, come on back, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a song, and it's all part of what I heard on the Georgia Northeastern. And that's what I'm trying to recreate in my layout room. That's something that you really want to look at is, what are your operational goals? And if you build the wrong layout, you're not going to be happy with working a switching layout if you wanted to watch mainline trains run.
Right.
One of the other things that's important to consider is, it's not necessarily the size of the layout, it's the number of turnouts that you have determines the complexity of the layout, which is kind of hard to understand. But you can have a small layout and a ton of switches, and that's where your maintenance issues are going to be, and that's where you're going to have problems with them stumbling on the frogs or the points or this or that or whatever. Or you could build a larger layout and just have a handful of turnouts, and you're watching the mainline trains run around the layout and doing a little bit of switching or passing on a siding or something. That's not a very complicated layout. It may be bigger, but it's not complicated. So bigger doesn't necessarily mean complicated. Then some of the other things to look at is the continuous run versus point to point. Do you really want a continuous run? When I first designed my layout, I put a continuous run very high at the top of the list of what my design goals were. I built it. I never used it. It was one of these things. It was like, why did I spend all this time doing this and making this continuous run option when I never use? I put it in a couple times, ran trains, and it's like, that's not what I enjoy. I don't enjoy just having trains run. If I'm going to run trains, I'm going to be operating. I'm going to be controlling the train, not just watching it run in circles. So what I ended up doing was taking that continuous run lift out section, I made it an industry. So I'm still using it, but it was repurposed basically. So how important is a continuous run versus point to point? And then one other thing with the point to point, you can make it where you can watch trains run back and forth. You get the Iowa scaled engineering motorman, and that will run the train back and forth in a push pull operation. And that way, there you could set it up for like a commuter rail would be perfect, or you could just have a little local switcher running back and forth, just shuttling cars, and that gives you that continuous run. But it's not a continuous circle; it's a continuous run because it's running back and forth without you having to do any inputs for it.
And I know Don Iris is also using that ISC Motorman for track cleaning, which is another brilliant way to use it.
Oh yeah.
You put a cleaning car on it and run it back and forth. So yeah, if you like that idea of being able to sit back and have a cold beverage and just watch the trains go, there is technology for that eliminates the need to try to build all that stuff like you did that you ended up not using.
Lessons learned. Right? Do as I say, not as I did, right?
There you go. There you go.
And then the final thing to consider, which most people have this discussion, internally, if not externally, what scale?
Right.
Do we want to do N, HO, S, O? Each of those has its advantages and disadvantages. If you want long trains and you don't have a whole lot of room and you don't really care that much about switching, a little, quote marks around that, N scale may be a good choice for you. HO, most common, most popular, you got a lot of options with HO. S scale is a little bit different. It's kind of that in between. Mike Ostertag, big proponent of S scale. There's a lot of benefits to S scale. And then O scale, I mean, the sound coming out of an O scale speaker shakes the room, jiggles the coffee cup that you got sitting on your table. It's hard to beat that O scale sound, but it takes up a lot of room. So again, look at what your options are and how you want to operate. If you like switching and doing car cards and waybills and that kind of stuff, and you go to N scale, I ran into that the other day at a friend's house. He models N scale, and he had an open house, and we had some guests come in, and they were saying, how do you guys switch the cards? I said, oh, we're gonna, use car cards and waybills. And I said, here's a card, and you read the number on the side of the well car. I said, there's the well car over there, and I went, uh-oh, I can't read the number on the side of the well car. I wear glasses, and it helps, but I was trying to read the car, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is going to be rather difficult if we're doing it that way. So there's some ways to overcome it, but in scale is going to be a little more difficult if you're trying to read car numbers and you're trying to get in there with a pick to open the couplers up and that kind of stuff. So people want to go back to, oh, well, I can get a lot more in it. Yes, you can. You can get a lot more in, and it's come a long way in the last few years. I mean, with sound, DCC, I mean, they run a whole lot better. Everything is really looking up for in scale, but be careful what you choose depending on your operational goals.
For sure. So let's talk about where we're going to put this layout. You mentioned a little bit of negotiating with the CEO on trying to get some real estate for this. Let's talk about where these layouts can exist.
Well, it's different for each person. You got to look around and see what you can carve out. Is there a usable space? Maybe in a multi-use room, put the layout on one side, and then you've got your TV entertainment center. There's some people that have done that where they have an entertainment center and it's on bookcases around the walls, and they have the TV off over the layout and stuff. So maybe a multi-use room. Maybe a spare bedroom is ideal. Tom Johnson, that's what he has his layout in, is a spare bedroom in his house. Fantastic layout. Went over there and operated on it. He's as good as it looks in pictures. It's even better in person. I mean, it was so much fun to operate. But again, it's what I like. It's very similar to what my layout is. Very similar operations and stuff. So for other people, they may walk in like they walk in on my layout and they go, yeah, okay, that's it. I'm going to watch trains go around for 10 minutes and leave. And then an hour and a half later, when we're doing operations, they're going, wow, there's a lot more to this than just watching trains go in a circle. I said, well, yes, there is, but it's on operations. If you like operations, that's great, but that may not be for everybody. So see if you can carve out some space. If you have a basement, some people are blessed with having a full-size basement. That's great. just because you have a basement doesn't mean you have to fill it up.
Right.
So maybe take part of the basement, start off small, do the TOMA, the one module approach, build a module, see how that goes, start expanding from there. Take that module and expand it, build it all the way. My friend Tim Garland, who's here in the just north of Atlanta, the Seaboard Central, that's what he's doing. He's building it, we'll say kind of modular. He's taking one area and taking it all the way to full scenery before he moves on to the next section. Then he moves on to that section, full scenery, moves on to the next part. He's building a helix, he's expanding. He has a full basement plan, but it's going to take him several years to get there. But in the meantime, the benefit he has is he can operate on that layout. I've been down there for operating sessions. We had a great time, and we're only switching a very small portion of what this total layout's going to look like. And we had a 2-hour operating session. It was great fun. So, maybe take it in steps. Don't try to eat the elephant all in one meal.
Right.
Break it up into smaller pieces and kind of see how it goes. And you may find that as you're building that layout, you don't need the whole thing. The other thing is people think, well, multi-level. I could do 2 levels. That'll give me a lot longer run and a lot more this and a lot more that. Do you really need it? You end up with a helix. You end up with some trade-offs with it. And maybe it's not the best choice. Maybe, for some people it is, but it may not be. So build the first level, see how that goes, and then maybe, make provisions for going to a second level. And again, going back to my friend Tim Garland, his first Seaboard Central layout, he had plans for a second level. He never built it. He said, I don't need it. It wasn't going to enhance his operations. He had plenty as it was, and it was adequate for what he needed at the time. Now, of course, the next layout is bigger, but it's still all one level. Also, talking about rooms, one of the important things are how you interact with the layout. And one of the first things that you really need to do is address the lighting in the room. If you don't have good lighting, then it's hard to go down there and work on the layout. It's hard to see things. It doesn't make it comfortable. So spend a little bit of time and money and get the lighting right to start with before you build the layout. Right. I took time before I built my layout, put lights in, painted the room, carpeting on the floor. I try not to make a mess. If you're going to be messy, put a drop cloth down. They do sell drop cloths. So, it's not good when paint ends up on the carpeting, but
No.
you can do flooring tiles if you want. That's a little more forgivable because you peel those up, put another one down. But that brings up the next one. What kind of flooring? If you're going to be, walking around the layout and as you get older, being on your feet gets a little harder depending on how long you want to operate. So maybe carpeting or carpet tiles or maybe some foam, tiles for the floor to give you a little bit of comfort rather than walking around on concrete. It starts wearing on you. I've been in some layouts where after a couple of hours, you're ready to take a break, sit down because you're walking around on concrete all the time. Another consideration is layout height. How high do you want the layout? I've had a lot of people talk to me, well, I want it so the kids can see it. So I'm going to build it at 36 inches. I'm like, okay. And how old are the kids? And you know what happens to kids as they get older? They grow.
All right.
And that layout that was at the perfect height for the kids, now when they're 17 or 18 years old, it's too low. And it's been too low for you for the whole time. So maybe look at, putting the layout at the height that you want. And typically it's somewhere in that 48 to 54 inches seems to be the ideal. Say, depending on how tall you are, from under your armpit to just above your belly button, somewhere in there is the ideal height. Mine is a little high for some people. I'm a little bit taller than average, but I haven't had anybody had a problem that's been over to operate, even if they were a little bit vertically challenged, to be able to see the layout at 54 inches and still be able to reach over and throw switches and make uncouplings and that kind of stuff.
Comfort is important, and especially for taller guys. You're tall. I'm a fairly taller guy, and yeah, if you're on a low layout and you're constantly bending over to operate it, yeah, it makes for a long operating session, and it can suck the fun out of the room for sure.
Yeah, and also you're getting a helicopter view versus a trackside view. I prefer to be down a little closer to trackside. Again, going back to trying to watch what the prototype does and put myself over there as the little miniature conductor. This is what I'm doing. So I like that trackside view. So I would prefer a little bit higher than just a little too low. So for me anyway, that's ideal is 54 inches. And it's like I talked about earlier, aisle space. You really want to have comfortable aisles. It's so tempting to, well, I can squeeze this a little bit more, make this a little bit bigger, give myself a little more, bench work space, but don't don't go any tighter than 28. 28 is pretty snug, and it's enough for two people to pass each other, but really anything smaller than that's going to be uncomfortable. And that also kind of leans into how deep is your layout? How are you going to operate with it? If you're going to reach in to throw switches and try to clean track and stuff, that 24, 30 inch is about as far back as you want to go to still make it reachable. I've been to some layouts, and guess where the problems are? Always in the spot that it's hardest to reach. At our club, we had a turnout that was located kind of in an awkward area, and you couldn't reach it from either side. Well, guess what turnout always had problems? Guess where we always derailed? On that turnout that you can't reach. So we ended up taking it out and moving the turnout to make it more accessible. And now we got a straight piece of track that comes off the turn there, and we don't have any problems anymore. It's amazing.
It sounds like workbench space really kind of is a key. Really highlight that one for a couple of the things we mentioned, not only aisle space, but also that achievable statement that you made earlier. By keeping that bench work narrower, you're now heading more towards achievable. Am I right?
Yes. And going back to another friend of mine, he made his layout, we'll say about 20 inches wide, and he has one mainline track going through that. And he says, you know how much I'm spending on static grass and all this other stuff? He says, I could have gotten by with half that width and saved a ton of money, and I wouldn't have lost anything on the layout, and it would have made the aisles a little bit bigger and a little more comfortable to operate. So, keep that in mind. Don't go too deep on your bench work if you want to be able to reach it, and also maybe keep the cost down a little bit. Tony Custer, everybody's heard of Tony. He advocates single track. You could get by with 8 to 10 inches of bench work width. It gives you enough in the front, enough in the back, photo backdrop, a little bit of tree line, that kind of stuff, and it's adequate to represent a main line kind of going through the country or whatever.
Kind of goes back to our good friend Scott Thornton and his theory of, theater, and by having that narrow bench work and minimizing that, you really make the trains the star of the show.
Exactly. And it allows you to be a little closer to them, so you can kind of get up and, we would say, take a time out, photo moment, watch the train roll through the scene. It's kind of neat to put yourself in that place as you're like rail fanning it from that era. That in this case it was the 1940s and 50s, and throw yourself in the Wayback Machine, and it kind of gets you in there, because you can kind of vision, oh, here's the train going across the the field and that kind of stuff.
So as we start to design our small layout, what are some of the factors that we want to consider?
First one, keep it simple. Don't go crazy. Don't try to cram too much. It's hard to believe, but I started off my track plan drawing of my layout. The room that I have, the first track plan, looks nothing like what I ended up with. I fell into the same trap. Oh, I can get this in there. I can jam this in. I can put these curves. I could do this. I could do that. It was horrible. It just 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. I was trying to get it all to fit, and the more I forced it, the worse it got, and I kept struggling. I was like, why am I having problems? And a good friend of mine says, cut stuff out. But I want it. No, cut stuff out. Okay, let me try. So I started cutting stuff out, and it got a little better. I cut more stuff out. It got better. And I finally ended up with something I still could have probably cut more out, and it would have been fine. But I finally hit that, I think this is going to work, and that's kind of what I ended up with. But don't crowd the space that you have. What you want to do is you want to edit versus compress. Everybody says, pack it in, get it closer. Your engine's in town A while the caboose is in town B. Is that realistic? Probably not. Maybe get rid of town B and just model town C. Okay, we're going to have to just cut that out. It's a hard decision, but you really want to edit versus compress. I mean, yes, you still want to compress some, because you don't necessarily need, a huge train or a huge industry. You could cut a little bit out. It probably won't. What you want to do is you want to capture the look and the flavor of something, but not necessarily window by window, door by door. If you get something that looks close, most people won't remember that that building had 4 doors that face the track. If you put 2 or 3 and it looks right, and the color is right, the shape is right, they'll say, yeah, that's the building. They won't remember that you cut out a door. So
yeah, it's about representation, right? It's not necessarily about nailing the prototype exact, every minuscule detail. It's about providing a great representation of it.
exactly. And I've got a few places on my layout, and people will say, oh, yeah, that's exactly right. Actually, I flipped it, and it faces south instead of north, and it's on the wrong side of the track. But when you look at it, it looks right, because the way you see the prototype, you see the sand tower, the fuel pump, and the engine house, and you're looking at it kind of the same, and you go, yeah, that's right. And you don't realize that the town, and actually the funny part is, on our club layout, we flipped Copper Hill and McKaysville, Georgia. You actually end up backwards coming into town, and nobody really recognizes that, but they flipped it to make it work on the layout. So very few people, unless you point that out to them, are really going to notice. So one of the other things which falls into that edit versus compress is negative space. And what is negative space? It's space that really is nothing special to look at. It's a field, it's a group of trees, it's a parking lot. It's just space that we see every day, and that's what makes it look right. And I dedicated a fair amount of space to a parking lot for a Dairy Queen. It's nothing goes on there. There's a couple of cars parked there. There's really nothing to see, but it looks right, because how many times have you seen these buildings and there's like, well, where would the cars park? How would the trucks get in there? How would this, you want to leave some of that negative space, that empty space between buildings, some of that empty fields, grass lots, abandoned buildings, nothing to see here, move along kind of stuff. But that helps the layout look more realistic. And there's a few places on my layout where I have just some grove of trees, and the train disappears behind the grove of trees, maybe for just a few feet or a few inches. But that gives you that sense of depth and the sense that the train is traveling. I've cut a huge chunk of the layout out, of the prototype out, and it's represented in just a few feet, but it kind of helps you feel like you're moving from one scene into the next. And then one of the other factors to consider is, do you need a runaround? If you're designing a small layout, do you really need a runaround track? It takes up a lot. It's hard to start fitting these things in. My good friend John Farrington, his old RSX RailServe line that was featured in Model Railroader magazine, or Great Model Railroads, had no runaround track. It was an L-shaped layout, and what he did was all the turnouts were oriented in the same direction. So he would simulate picking up cars from the interchange. His engine was on one end, and everything was a trailing point move. So he was able to switch the layout with just a trailing point move, and then once everything was done, he would do a shove move back to the interchange track. Saved a ton of space, lots of operation, real fun layout to operate on, and he saved, like I said, a lot by not trying to jam in a runaround track. So maybe you need a runaround, maybe you not. It depends on the design. And what you want to do is you want to establish minimums. Don't cheat. It's always tempting. Oh, I'm going to do 24-inch radius. I'm going to do number 6 turnouts. But you know what? A number 4 would work, and an 18-inch radius will fit here, and I can get this, and you get back to that. I can make it fit. I can press all this stuff in, and I'll make it fit. Well, if you really know what a number 4 turnout is, what you're doing when you put a number 4 turnout in is you're putting in a 15-inch radius into your layout. Is that going to work for that 6-axle big GE diesel that you got?
Probably
it might
not.
work. It might work. It might go through there, but it's going to look a little funny going through there. I run only 4-axle diesels. I try to keep them short. It looks better going through 24-inch radius curves and number 6 turnouts. Those were my minimums. If I had to do it again, I might go 28-inch radius. It just looks a little better. One of the things that for my layout that works is you view the curves from the inside of the curve, so you don't notice that space or the gap between the cars as they're going around the turn, and it kind of opens up. If you're viewing it from the outside, it's a lot more noticeable. On the inside, not quite as noticeable, so you can get by with that 24-inch radius curve. But a number 6 turnout, you're looking at a 26-inch radius in that one section of the turnout. So a number 6 turnout and a 24 or 28-inch radius works pretty well. Those are some good minimums to have, but you don't want to cheat. You want to try to keep things reasonable depending on the equipment that you're running. Now, if you want to run really big locomotives, the big boy or the turbines or the whatever, you might want to go with number 8s and 30 something inch radius, but the radius really impacts your layout design. Probably the biggest impact on your layout is going to be your radius. And what I do is when I'm designing a layout, I'll determine my minimum radius and then make a copy of that and place that around the room and use that to start figuring out the curves. And that's where it really, really drives your layout design is trying to take that curve and put it over here and then connect the track to it. And you realize, man, it takes up a lot if I'm doing a 30 something inch radius. Could I get by with a little smaller? Maybe. But again, depends on what you're trying to accomplish and how much space do you have. One of the other things that adds complexity to a track plan is grades. Do you really need a grade on your layout? Maybe if you're modeling a pusher district, somewhere where you want to have helpers, push the trains over the mountain and that kind of stuff. But it adds complexity. If you're doing a switching layout, one of the issues that you have is wherever you're going to set out cars, the track needs to be level or they're going to want to roll away on you. So you might have to have a little brake that's a wire or some type of wheel chalk or something. So you really want to have your switching areas flat. Well, if you're designing a switching layout, why not just make the whole layout flat and then vary the contours, make some depressed areas, make some areas above the track, make some areas below the track. Although the whole layout is level, it gives you a sense that you have some variations in your terrain. And that's what I did on my layout. I've got a couple areas where it goes across the river. So I lowered the bench work in that area to give you the river scene in a couple of spots. And then I brought up some hills / mountains or lumps, if you will, just gentle rolling hills. And that kind of gives you a sense of, you're traveling through an area that's not perfectly flat, but the track is completely level. And then probably one of the other important factors that you need to look at is staging. Where are your trains going to come from and go to? In this case, staging can be on the layout. It could be a staging cassette. It could be hidden. Or you could set up an interchange track. Any of those are good options. But you want to have a feeling that your trains are coming from somewhere or going to somewhere. So something as simple as just a spur off to the backdrop, that's your interchange track. That's where your cars are going to be set out and picked up at the beginning and the end of the operating session. Or are you going to start in a yard at one end, work your way to the other end? You've got another yard. That's typical, railroad, have a yard on each end. Staging takes up a lot of room. Hidden staging, depending on accessibility to it, could be problematic. Again, operated on some people's layouts. Hidden staging can be a nightmare. Guess where the trains always have problems? Guess where they derail or somebody doesn't stop in time, or you got to have cameras, you got to have sensors, it adds to the complexity of the layout. So if you do, just keep that in mind, make it accessible so that you can at least work on it and access it during an operating session if you have to. But I prefer visible staging, and that's what I've got on my layout. I have a staging cassette that sets up in the adjacent room. I set it up. I put my trains out there. It simulates the Elizabeth Yard, which is where the Georgia Northeastern interchanges with CSX. And that's where my trains start off, and that's where they end up. And I've added a couple of tracks. The original design of my layout, I had 2 tracks. I added 2 more tracks to the staging because that made it a little bit wider and about 6 inches longer. And now the crew starts off, rather than having their train staged already in order in the staging yard, now it's a yard where they have to pull their cars from different tracks, build their train, and then move into the layout room. And that adds about 15 to 20 minutes, just switching 6 cars, getting them in the right order, and then departing the yard and heading out. So you can get a lot of operational value out of just a small staging yard that's visible on your layout.
Now, kind of tying in all of this when we make these decisions, not only, what we're going to include and everything else, is also selecting a prototype or freelance railroad and its type to make that decision. What are we going to model? What railroad are we going to follow? And that definitely helps us keep things in check.
Absolutely. Do you want a freelance or do you like the prototype? There's advantages and disadvantages to both. There's some fantastic freelance railroads out there. I mean, you look at them and you go, oh, that's got to be a real railroad. And you look it up and you go, oh, no, that's just John Parker's layout.
Right.
I didn't realize it was, it was freelanced or whatever, or proto freelanced. So if you're looking for a good candidate to model, maybe a short line or a class 1 branch line. And those work better for smaller layouts. There's so many fantastic short lines out there. When I first started posting videos on my layout and everything, it's like, oh, that's a cool freelance railroad, Tom. That the Georgia Northeastern. I said, no, it's a real railroad. Look it up. And they're like, really? Never heard of it. I hadn't either until I moved to Northeast Georgia. So,
Right.
There's some great short lines out there that are fantastic candidates to model. I've stumbled across a few, and my line is, hi, my name is Tom. I'm addicted to short lines. Every time I find a short line, I want to model it. I was like, oh, I'm going to tear my layout out and model this one now because it's so cool. So there's so many great short lines out there. And what you can do is kind of make it your own. I mean, adopt it, and then it becomes your layout. And now when people see the layout, Georgia Northeastern, if you Google search Georgia Northeastern on Google, guess whose layout comes up on there? Mine. I'm even ahead of some of the prototype photos because I posted stuff online. So it pops up in Google searches and it's like, oh, wow, that's pretty neat. So if you pick the right railroad, you might end up adopting it and it becomes your railroad, even though it's a real prototype short line. Or maybe you want to look at some class 1s. If you like class 1 railroads, maybe look at some of their branch lines. They're getting a little harder to find, but if you go back a few years, maybe 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a lot more branch lines, and they make a fantastic candidate for a model railroad. A good friend of mine, Stephen Floyd, is modeling a branch, and it makes for a fantastic layout. I've operated on it. It's just so much fun. It's a one line goes out and you switch the industries, you get to the end, you do a turn, and then you work your way back, switching the rest of the industries. Again, 2 to 3 hour operating session, just switching 10 industries with maybe 6 to 10 cars. I mean, so much fun. But what you want to do is if you take a small railroad, you're looking at the big picture. So you could take a small railroad and do a lot with it because maybe the prototype's only 20 miles versus trying to compress a Chicago to Seattle in a 20 by 20 room. That's going to be a lot harder. So if you pick a big railroad, maybe get a small picture of it. Find a section that you really want to model between closer points rather than trying to model the whole thing. It gets very difficult to try to model thousands of track miles in a reasonably sized basement.
And I think that choice too, when talk about freelance opens up a lot of opportunity to kind of make it your own, but you also got to know your skill set because freelance also demands an entirely different skill set, the ability to paint, to design locomotives, design logos. It opens up a whole other world. And that, again, going back to knowing your why and your skill set.
Yeah, that was one of the issues I had when I started with the Georgia Northeastern was I was like, okay, there's no commercially manufactured Georgia Northeastern locomotive out there. Never will be, probably. But there was a decal set. And I was able to find them online through various people on eBay and hobby stores and that kind of stuff. So I was able to do my fleet. It's gotten a lot easier now with these fantastic custom decal companies out there. You send them an idea and they send you back, the drawings, and it's like, oh, this is fantastic. And they print it up for you. And it's relatively reasonable considering the amount of work that it takes to do all this stuff. So it's gotten a lot easier to make your own freelance railroad. But like you said, you want to, try to keep the guardrails on, as you've mentioned in several of your other podcasts. Try to consider how the prototype would do things. Don't get too far away from what the prototype would do, even if it's a freelance railroad. Make it look realistic. Pick a paint scheme that looks like it's something out of the EMD catalog that somebody would go and say, yes, this is what I'm going to pick out. This is how this railroad, or it looks similar to Railroad X or Railroad Y. So that makes it more believable. And I think that's where some of the people have been so successful with designing their locomotives to look like a prototype railroad would look. And the equipment that they would stay with a specific EMD or Alco or whatever it is. That's what the Georgia Northeastern did, is they were all EMD locomotives, different models, but they were all EMD. Why? Because it made easier for the mechanics to work on them because they were all had similar parts, not necessarily the same, but similar parts. So that's something that you want to consider if you're looking to freelance is consider how the prototype would do it and then kind of go from there.
All right, now that we've got a basic idea and we're starting to put together a track plan, let's talk about building this and some of the layout construction methods and things to consider as we start to put the screw in the first board.
Yes. Well, there's many options for you could do spline, you could do plywood, you could do tabletop, you could do cookie cutter. But for most layouts, a shelf style layout allows your greatest flexibility and easiest access. And what you can do, like what I did, was I built the benchwork in the garage because remember my train room was finished. I had carpeting on the floor, so I want to be cutting wood in the train room. So I built the benchwork in the garage, carried it into the train room, and then screwed it to the walls. And that made for a lot less mess. So a shelf style conventional framing, just like you'd frame up a wall in a house, get some 1x4s or 1x6s, frame everything out, and then you can decide if you want foam or plywood. Advantages and disadvantages to both. Foam can be a little noisy. It gets a little bit of a drumming. One things that you can do to reduce that is put a thin sheet of Luan plywood, maybe 3/16 or 1/8, and then put the foam on top of that. The foam allows you to give you those contours. It's easier to carve, so you can carve out the little ditches and the drainage ditches along the sides of the railroad, and then make your hills and stuff. Plywood's a little bit harder to do that. You can't really carve into it, so keep that in mind. Also, think about portability. If you're going to possibly move the layout, maybe build it in modules, like some people have been doing. You could use the IKEA shelving units and then put your module on top of it, and that allows you, if you're younger and foresee a move in your near future, build it as bench work that you can move. You can take the structures off, take all that off, and then you don't lose your layout. You can quickly set it back up in the new house and maybe add a little section to it, or may have to remove a section or turn it, make a 90-degree curve, and then you can reuse so you haven't lost everything that you've worked on over the last year or two.
Another big factor in all of this is also in the size of your layout in all of these methods is what are you going to use your layout for? And we talked before about those that like to do continuous running and just watch your trains go by and spectate. But for several of us, we really enjoy operations. And I know thinking about operations on a general point, like what are you going to have your railroad do, definitely is a factor in building the right size layout for that as well.
Yes, what you want to consider is how long of an operating session do you really want? There's some of these ops till you drop weekends and stuff. As you get older, those become a little more difficult to do. How long of an operating session do you want? And I think the general consensus, and we may hear some different opinions on that, is typically a couple of hours is about right. As you start getting a little bit more than that, you get tired, you're ready to take a break, get off your feet, that kind of stuff. I've found with my layout, it's almost impossible to believe, but I can have over a 3.5 hour operating session on my layout it's in a 9x10 room. One switch job could take about an hour and a half, maybe almost 2 hours, depending on the crew. That's one job. And then I've got several other jobs. And if you run them back to back, then you can end up with over a 3 hour operating session. Typically, when I have guests come over, they'll do a job or two, but very few will want to do all 4 jobs, which I have. And that's something that you want to consider is how long of an operating session do you want? You may find that you don't need that big of a layout if you want to only do an hour operating session. Come home at the end of the day, kick back, pick your favorite beverage, switch a few cars, turn the layout off, go off and do whatever else you want to do. 30 minutes to an hour is fun. You switch some cars, you kind of get yourself, you decompress at the end of the day. Is that what you're going to use your layout for? Then you don't necessarily need a large layout. Now, if you want to have a crew of 15 to 20 people over, you're probably going to need a bigger layout, and you're probably going to end up working maybe 3 or 4 hours for an operating session to make it worthwhile for those people that are going to travel long distances.
So that leads us into 2 things here, Tom. We've gone and we've talked a lot about building the right size layout on the construction side. But then we're going to talk about in a future show here, operations in a little bit more in depth of making decisions on building a right-side layout around the operations aspect. So look forward to having you back for that. But we did ask that question as our question of the month. What is your ideal length of time for an operating session and why? So we're going to have a listen here. We had 12 entries into the question of the month. We'll go through these and listen to them. We're going to start with Carson.
My name is Carson, and I'm from Ontario, Canada. I think the ideal length of an operating session on my 6-foot layout would be an hour and a half. On my small 6-foot layout, I think it would be very easy to get bored of the scenery after anything over an hour and a half. I've never operated on a larger layout, though, so that I might be wrong with that. Thanks for making the podcast.
Well, I think that's, what Carson hit on it. For his layout, it's an hour and a half. For other bigger layouts, it may be more, but kind of fits into about where you were right in about that wheelhouse.
Yes, absolutely. You're looking at, for a 6-foot layout, about an hour and a half is perfect. You got plenty of switching, keeps you interested. But going any longer than that, like you said, it's probably pushing it on a 6-foot layout.
Let's have a listen to our favorite mystery man from South Carolina.
Hi, I'm C-Says from South Carolina. My optimum operating session length would be 3 hours without a break. Going over 3 hours, I believe there should be a half-hour break for the crew so they can all get refreshed and then get back at it. I really enjoy the podcast and look forward to listening to a new one every week. And I'm looking forward to that Z-Scale train set I won in the December giveaway.
And I know by now he's got that Z-Scale layout and he's enjoying that miniature world along with his HO layout that he's building. And 3 hours. And you definitely need a break after a few hours of operating for sure.
Yes. One of the layouts I operate on does like a 3-hour operating session. And then right as the clock strikes 12, whether we're done or not, the layout gets shut off and it's time to move on.
Absolutely. Let's take a listen from around the globe, coming to us from Australia, Darren Johns.
Hello, it's Darren Johns from South Australia here. So what is the ideal length for an operating session and why? So from my opinion, that can be sort of a bit of a how long is a piece of string. So there's various factors that I think we could look at why sessions could be anywhere from a couple of hours right the way through to an entire day on some occasions. I'm sure people do that out there with various breaks. So number one would come down to realism and immersion, how long the sessions are going to be, how immersive you want to make the experience. Longer operating sessions I've found, layouts I've run, is with more complex operations and intricate, more switching obviously can take more time away. Enjoyment and engagement. So shorter sessions might be more suitable for your casual operators. However, the longer sessions, 4-6 hours and above, can be more fulfilling for the enthusiasts who enjoy the detail of the operations. And also the social interaction is very important. So I firmly believe the operating session doesn't stop when the trains stop. The operating session continues on when you have your chit-chat and a cup of coffee and a few biscuits or pizza or whatever your poison is at the end of the session to talk about how things went and how things we could do better next time. So I hope that answered the question, and thanks guys and gals out there and Ray for putting on such a great show, and I continue to listen to it each month, or each week I should say.
I'll listen to us each week. We certainly appreciate that, Darren. And I think that's another aspect to think about, the social aspect. And that's where you want that a little bit more room and a little more aisle space, or maybe even just a social space within your layout area, which may come into factor.
Yeah, well, I do a little bit different on my operating session. He mentioned about food, and you're not thinking right if you're hungry. So what I do is I have people come over at noon. We have lunch. I prepare lunch. And we do our chit chat and kind of get to know and what are you doing, that kind of stuff. And then we go and operate the layout on a full stomach. So that allows us to do the operating session and we have that social interaction before. And then the operating session is very relaxed, very low stress in my case because it's just a 2-person crew. So we do have a little bit of time. But what I found is if you do the lunch and you talk before, then when they get into the operating session, they're more focused on the operations. And the side chit chat doesn't happen as much, which is nice because now they're putting themselves in the crew's position of operating this train and trying to figure out the switch moves and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I think we got to have another third podcast just on food at operating sessions. That's a whole other topic that we could go a long while on. Let's head from Australia out to Long Island.
Hi, Ray. It's Dave Barraza from Long Island, New York. I just had a session with 3 guys. It took 5 hours. I had a session the other week with 16 guys. 5 hours. I guess the answer is 5 hours.
Well, going a little bit long on Long Island and a 5-hour operating session. But again, it's all about if they're having fun. If it becomes exhausting, maybe the fun, you got to keep that factor going of if their guys are having fun and that you have the ability to keep going, we'll keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. 5 hours. I would hope that there's a break in there somewhere because that can get a little tough being on your feet for that long.
Now, let's hope there's a break and some food in there too. Let's head ourselves down to Palestine, Texas, where I know they serve treats.
Hi, Ray and everybody. This is Devin Jackson from the Mesquite Belt Railroad, located in Palestine, Texas. Operation sessions on the 20 by 40-foot Mesquite Belt Railroad run between 2.5 and 3 hours, and that gives everybody enough time to run more than one job and to hit the well-stocked refrigerator and grab a homemade snack made by my wife. After about 3 hours, everybody's knees and back start reminding them that, well, they're not as young as they used to be. So about that time, everybody's ready to go home and convalesce. So about 2.5 to 3 hours max time on the Mesquite Belt Railroad, unless you're just a glutton for punishment, and we can let you run longer by yourself. Hope everybody has a great week. Everybody stay safe. Talk to you later. Ray, come and visit us again. See you then.
Well, I can't wait to get back to Palestine, Texas and see the Mesquite Belt layout of Devin Jackson and family, and great hospitality there with those folks. And there's another vote for that 2.5 to 3 hour time frame.
That sounds about right. That's also what our club does is about 2.5, 3 hours at the most. And after that 3 hour mark, the enthusiasm quickly fades.
Let's have a listen to a very familiar voice here on Around the Layout podcast.
Hi, Ray and everyone. My name's Don Iris, owner of P&W Railroad in Florida, Sebastian, Florida. The ideal operating session for me would be anywhere between 3 and 3.5 hours. It's going as much as 4, but I'd rather keep it between 3 to 3.5 hours, only because for what we have to do and the amount of trains we run, we couldn't get it all done in any less time than that. So, I mean, the more trains you're running, obviously the longer it has to be. You can only have 4 or 5 operators here to move everything we need to move in one op session. So, yeah, I would say 3.5 hours for me. All right? Have a good day.
Well, I got the opportunity to run Don's layout in early February, and I can tell you that it was 3 hours, and I was completely immersed, and that's the difference. Time flew by, and the operations just drew me right into the layout. And that's really, as a layout owner, that's really where you want your operators to be.
Exactly. Well, I had the privilege of operating on his layout. And like you said, the time just flew by. I had a great time. And it was right about that 3 hour mark, maybe a touch over. But the time just went by. Like you said, you're so immersed in doing the job and working the railroad that didn't notice that it took that long.
No, great layout for sure.
Absolutely.
Let's hear from Eddie Benningfield.
Hey, Ray, what's going on? Eddie Benningfield here from Model Train People. To answer your question on what the ideal length of an operating session is, I would say whatever time you're able to get. So personally in my life, I'm busy with work. I've got a very young son, and those obligations, both outside of the house and in caring for a little, will always come before putting significant time into running ops on a layout or really anything with a hobby. So if I can steal away 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour in some cases, that little bit of respite is going to do wonders for my mental health and for me, and allow me to go back refreshed to taking care of those obligations that frankly require my priority attention. That's it. I hope you're doing well and hope you stay safe. So take care.
Oh, sounds like Eddie's got a great mirror, doesn't he?
Yes. Well, that's a really good point. Like I mentioned earlier, realistically, how much time do you have to operate the layout? And one of the benefits, again, with a smaller layout is you don't have to finish the op session. I've had a couple of cases where people have come down to my layout and we've operated, and they look at their watch and they go, oh, I got to go. I need to be at a certain place at a certain time. And we just stop the operating session right in the middle doesn't impact it. I can reset the layout real easy. It's just a handful of cars. Other layouts, if you stop in the middle, you've got a nightmare. There's no way that you're going to be able to do something like that. So in my case, it works out perfect. If somebody, their phone rings and, my wife's calling me, I got to go ahead and go. Not a problem.
Absolutely. All right, let's head to Western New York.
This is Ed O'Connell from Rochester, New York. Most of the operating sessions that I go to, whether it be locally or as part of a ops weekend, tend to be about 2.5 to 3 hours long. And that may or may not include the briefing session beforehand. But it's very important that the people show up on time so that the session can start on time. A lot of people tend to find that trying to stand for more than 3 hours and their legs just get tired. But there are times where I've gone to operating sessions that have gone on longer than that, maybe 4, maybe even close to 5 hours. Because I'm one of the kind that I just love ops and I just want to keep going. And my task is to get the job done. So as long as it takes is how long I want to go. And I just get into it. Once I'm in the groove, I'm there. But for the most part, I'll be considerate for the other people. And, 3 hours is probably pretty good, but I don't mind a marathon session every now and then.
Talking about physical condition here too, aren't we? It seems multiple times about, knees and backs, and that's definitely something to keep in mind too.
Like I mentioned, carpeting on the floor goes a long way to making it more comfortable to stand for an extended period of time. One of the other options that you have is a friend of mine has his layout where he can operate it from rolling chairs. He's figured that eventually he's going to get to that point where it's going to get harder for him to stand up. He has, we'll say, concrete floors or laminate floors, and he's able to set up a rolling chair where he can roll around. Now, he built the layout a little bit lower, so it was okay to operate it from a chair. It's a little bit low when you're standing, but not bad. But operating from the chair is great for some people because it allows them to, be able to operate a little bit longer. You don't have that leg fatigue that these guys are talking about. And I think everybody gets it. I don't care how old you are. If you're on your feet for an extended period of time, it wears on you after a while.
All right, back to Texas with Joe Bohannon.
How we doing, guys? This is Joe Bohannon with Chinook Lines down in Texas. I find the ideal length of an operating session to be about 2 hours of actual runtime. I find, though, as a layout owner, the real challenge is being able to create jobs and challenges that fill that space for my operators. I have had operators run certain jobs and get done with them really quickly, asking for what's next. And I've had other operators who don't run them very quickly and run out of time. In situations like that, I've had to find other ways to increase the efficiency and give them tools to try to make it not such a daunting task, such as adding extra tracks in the yards or splitting up the jobs. But overall, I think after about 2 hours, most people are kind of winding down and just want to talk or relax after that point. All right, thanks, guys. Keep it up.
Well, thank you, Joe. And there's another layout that I've had the opportunity to operate, the Chinook Lines down in Texas. And Joe hit some very good points there.
Yeah, lots of points. Some of those will have to go into another show because he talks about, having jobs for people and not sitting around. I operated on one layout. I took one job and then I ended up sitting underneath the layout for about an hour waiting for my next job because there was no way to get out of the room without crawling on your belly under the lift out section. So I didn't want to have that on my layout. So when I had a layout with multiple operators, I had things scheduled so that I've planned this person would go from here to there to work each of the jobs so that they didn't have extended periods of time with nothing to do.
All right, we go to Connecticut and Joe Mame.
Hey, everybody. My name is Joe Mame. I am from Brooklyn, Connecticut, and my answer to the question of the month has 2 parts. The first part is an operating session by myself. If I'm running a solo op session, I typically do not want to operate anything longer than around a half hour just because I start to lose interest at that point and the brain starts to wander. If I'm operating with a group of friends, then typically around an hour and a half is my happy spot. Anything more starts to feel a bit forced and a bit like work. And I always like to leave the operating session on a positive note, having a good time and looking forward to the next one. So awesome job, Ray, Paul, Don, the whole crew. Good job, y'all.
Well, thank you, Joe. And I know Joe and I talk about this quite a bit. I think part of the factor of how long a ideal operating session is when the operating session is being held. And we talk about that if you're somebody who's still in the workforce and you have a Monday through Friday job. Sometimes those late night off sessions can be really a drag, but maybe on a Saturday morning, you're willing to go a little bit longer.
He brings up some very good points there. If you're operating by yourself, maybe half hour to an hour is good. I'll go down and just switch some cars on my layout. About an hour, like he said, about 30 minutes to an hour is fun. I, kind of just decompress, switch some cars. But if I'm operating with another person, that hour and a half, 2 hours is perfect, and the time just flies by because we're so absorbed into doing the operating session. So excellent points.
Absolutely. Now we're going to head out to Illinois.
This is Matthew Fricks from Manhattan, Illinois. I'm on all the Gateway Western lines from Root House, Illinois to Jacksonville and Springfield, Illinois. My personal preference for is about 3 hours operating, depending on the layout size. I think that offers plenty of operating time without becoming overwhelming. On my layout, operators run around 3 hours, and each day is split into 2 sessions. A morning session focuses around the 8 a.m. crew call that worked from Root House to Jacksonville in the mobile plastics plant. My afternoon sessions focus around a 1400 crew who would work the yard in Root House and then out and back to Springfield, Illinois. Once I have fast clocks in place, crews will be shut down if they run out of time. And then the following session, the oncoming crew would have to dog catch the previous local and finish its work. I think this should work out well. Very excited and optimistic to see how it all plays out. Thanks.
Well, Matt hit kind of that point you were talking about resetting layouts and, making a plan for if your crew does outlaw, how do you handle it? And he's got that set up pretty well on his layout.
Sounds like a fantastic way to operate. Again, just time somebody out, say, you're on the law. That's it. Cut them off. And then the next crew's got to come in and pick up from where they were. Great way to do it.
Absolutely. And we'll finish up going back to Australia and another familiar voice for the podcast.
Paul Cassar from Sydney, Australia. What's the ideal length of an operating session and why? For me, it's around about an hour and a half. My operating sessions are set up to switch around 20 cars a session. And I find that's just an hour and a half long enough for me to find some time to go into the layout room and do some switching and relaxing and not taking up all of my time. Having said that, because I use a switch list, I can go in for half an hour and do part of the switch list and then come back later. Enjoying the podcast, Ray. Keep up the good work.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for all you do for the podcast. And we know that you like to go out to your garage and run your Riverbelt line at your leisure, and you well enough to know you've also got a lot of other things. You're still working with grandchildren and know about the time that you have, and that's all the things that you were talking about, Tom.
Yes, sounds like he's got it figured out. It sounds like overall we're looking at that 2 hour to 3 hour sweet spot for most layouts. Again, depending on the size of the layout, smaller layouts probably going to be more towards the hour and a half range, but you'll find that you really don't need as much layout as you think you do if you start doing some time studies. And we could talk about that on another show, but just switching a few cars, it's amazing. Again, I kept coming back to my one job, 6 cars in, 6 cars out, hour and a half, almost 2 hours. And it's switching like 6 industries. So if you think you need a huge layout to get an hour and a half, 2 hour operating session, you really don't.
Absolutely. And we'll talk more about that, as you mentioned, on a future show. We'll talk about operations on a small layout. Looking forward to that conversation. Until then, why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and where folks can find it?
Well, the book is a couple years old. You can find it. It was a Kalmbach. Now Kalmbach's been taken over by Firecrown, but you can find it on trains.com or just type in building the right size layout in your favorite search engine and it'll pop up, and you've got multiple options for purchasing the book through various outlets and stuff. Some hobby stores may have it on the shelf. I've seen it in a few hobby stores around here. Again, it talks about basically taking you through planning, designing, and building the layout. Talks a little bit about track planning, layout construction, prototype-inspired track plans, even cover a little bit of prototype operation, some operational details, which we can talk about more in another show, and even a little bit about op session paperwork, how you want to have your trains move, and then conducting your operating sessions. So I tried to cover a lot of what I do on my layout and what other people have. Again, thanks to all the guys and gals that contributed to the photos and content for the book. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to do it. I was the one that kind of put it all together, but without their help, it wouldn't have been possible. So again, thanks to everybody that contributed material for the book. And hopefully, if you like it, go out and get a copy.
And again, that's Building the Right Size Layout. We'll also share a link on our website, aroundthelayout.com/147. And we'll have a whole bunch of links. As we mentioned, a whole bunch of folks that have been on the podcast. So we'll share links to those episodes as well, where you can check those out. And also, we'll share a link to Tom's website, where he talks a little bit more about his Georgia Northeastern Railroad and his adventures in model railroading as well. He got some blog stuff in there as well. So definitely a lot of great stuff to check out there. So until the next time, Tom, thank you so much for coming by.
Ray, I really appreciate it. You guys are doing a fantastic job on the Around the Layout podcast, and I can't wait to come back again.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.